system. Nowhere is this more clear than in relation to the dumping of steel on global markets. The urgent need to act to remove excess capacity was recognised last year at the G20, but not enough has been done since. If we are to avoid unilateral action by nations seeking to protect themselves from unfairly priced steel, we need immediate collective action. So we agreed that the global forum established last year needs to be more effective and the pace of its work must quicken. In order to ensure its work gets the necessary attention and there is senior accountability, I have pressed for relevant ministers from around the world to meet in this forum. The UK will play a leading role in championing all these reforms so that all citizens can share in the benefits of global growth. As we leave the European Union, we will negotiate a new, comprehensive, bold and ambitious free trade agreement with the EU. But we will also seize the exciting opportunities to strike deals with old friends and new partners. And at this summit, I held a number of meetings with other world leaders, all of whom made clear their strong desire to forge ambitious new bilateral trading relationships with the UK after Brexit. This included America, Japan, China and India. And this morning I welcomed Australian Prime Minister Turnbull to Downing Street, where he also reiterated his desire for a bold new trading relationship. Mr. Speaker, all these discussions are a clear and powerful vote of confidence in British goods, British services, the British economy and the British people, and I look forward to building on them in the months ahead. On climate change, the UK reaffirmed our commitment to the Paris Agreement, which is vital if we are to take responsibility for the world we pass on to our children and grandchildren. Mr. Speaker, there is not a choice between decarbonisation and economic growth, as the UK's own experience shows. We've reduced our emissions by around 40% over the last 16 years, but grown our GDP by almost two-thirds. So I and my counterparts at the G20 are dismayed at America's withdrawal from this agreement. I spoke personally to President Trump to encourage him to rejoin the Paris Agreement, and I continue to hope that is exactly what he will do. On international development, we reaffirmed our commitment to spend 0.7% of gross national income on development assistance, and we set out plans for a new long-term approach to reduce Africa's reliance on aid. This includes focusing on supporting African aspirations for trade and growth, creating millions of new jobs, and harnessing the power of capital markets to generate trillions of new investment. And we welcomed Germany's new compact with Africa, which reflects those principles. On migration, I expressed the UK's continued support for the scale of the challenge facing Italy and agreed with Prime Minister Gentiloni that a UK expert Home Office and DFID delegation will travel out to Italy to see how we can help further. Mr. Speaker, this is yet further evidence that, while we are leaving the European Union, as a global Britain, we will continue to work closely with all our European partners. The G20 also agreed to use the upcoming negotiations on the UN Global Compacts to seek the comprehensive approach that the UK has been arguing for. This includes ensuring refugees claim asylum in the first safe country they reach, improving the way we distinguish between refugees and economic migrants, and developing a better overall approach to managing economic migration. It also includes providing humanitarian and development assistance to refugees in their home region. And at this summit, the UK committed £55 million to support the government of Tanzania in managing its refugee and migrant populations and to support the further integration of new naturalised Burundian refugees. Turning to modern slavery, it is hard to comprehend that in today's world, innocent and vulnerable men, women and children are being enslaved, forced into hard labour, raped, beaten and passed from abuser to abuser for profit. We cannot and will not ignore this dark and barbaric trade in human beings that is simply horrifying in its inhumanity. That's why I put this issue on the G20 agenda at my first summit a year ago, and at this summit I push for a global and coordinated approach to the complex business supply chains which can feed the demand for forced labour and child labour. Mr. Speaker, our groundbreaking UK Modern Slavery Act requires companies to examine all aspects of their businesses, including their supply chains, and to publish their results. I called on my G20 partners to follow Britain's lead. and I welcomed Germany's proposed Vision Zero Fund, to which the UK is contributing, as an important part of helping to ensure the health and safety of workers in these global supply chains. Finally, we agreed to create better job opportunities for women, to remove the legal barriers and end the discrimination and gender-based violence that restrict opportunities both at home and abroad. And as part of this, the UK is contributing to the Women Entrepreneurs Finance Initiative launched by the World Bank, which will provide more than $1 billion to support women in developing countries to start and grow businesses. This is not just morally right, it is economically essential. And the UK will continue to play a leading role in driving forward women's economic empowerment across the world. Mr. Speaker, of course, we did not agree on everything at this summit, in particular on climate change. But when we have such disagreements, it is only more important that we come together in forums such as the G20 to try and resolve them. And as a global Britain, we will continue to work at bridging differences between nations and forging global responses to issues that are fundamental to our prosperity and security and to that of our allies around the world. That is what we did at this summit. That is what this government will continue to do, and I commend this statement to the House.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Prime Minister for an advanced copy of this statement. And I'm really surprised you had so much to contribute to the G20, given there was barely a mention of international policy in her party's election manifesto, or indeed any policy, so much so that the government is apparently now asking other parties for their policy ideas. And so, if the Prime Minister would like it, I'm very happy to furnish her with a copy of our election manifesto, or better still, an early election in order that the people of this country can decide. Let's face it, Mr. Speaker, the government has run out of steam, and at a pivotal moment in our country and the world, amid uncertainty of Brexit, conflict in the Gulf states, nuclear sabre rattling over North Korea, refugees continuing to flee war and destruction, ongoing pandemics, cross-border terrorism, poverty, inequality and the impact of climate change are the core global challenges of our time. Just when we need strong government, we have weakness from this government. The US President attempts to pull the plug on the Paris climate change deal, and only, Mr. Speaker, a belated, informal mention and brief meeting with him. No ability to sign a joint letter from European leaders at the time he made the announcement. The UK's trade deficit, Mr. Speaker, is growing at a time when we're negotiating our exit from the European Union. The UK-backed Saudi war in Yemen continues to kill, displace and injure thousands, with 300,000 cases of cholera, and on this, a man-made catastrophe. But worse, Mr. Speaker, the government continues to sell arms to Saudi Arabia, one of the most repressive and brutal regimes that finances terrorism and is breaching humanitarian law. The court may have ruled that the government acted legally. It certainly is not acting ethically. Mr. Speaker, we on this side welcome the ceasefire agreed between the US and Russia in the southwest of Syria. It is good news. Did the Prime Minister play any role in those negotiations? Will she commit to work with them to expand the ceasefire to the rest of that poor, benighted country? The US President's attempt to pull out of the Paris climate change deal is both reckless and very dangerous. The commitments made in Paris are a vital move to stop the world reaching the point of no return on climate change. Other G20 leaders have been unequivocal with the US President, but not our Prime Minister, who did apparently not raise the issue in a bilateral meeting, but later raised it informally. I don't quite know what that means, but maybe the Prime Minister can tell us exactly what the nature of that meeting was. What a complete neglect of her duty both to our people and perhaps equally importantly, to our planet as well. We need a leader prepared to speak out and talk up values of international cooperation, of human rights, social justice and respect for international law. She now needs to listen. So I ask this: will she condemn attempts to undermine global cooperation on climate change? Will she take meaningful action against our country's role in global tax avoidance, which starves many developing countries of funding for sustainable growth, which is also sucking investment out of our public services? will she offer European Union nationals in Britain the same rights as they have now? What proposals does she have, and what discussions did she have on Britain's membership of Euratom? Will she halt immoral arms sales to Saudi Arabia, as Germany has done, and back Germany's call to end the bombing in Yemen? We've heard the Prime Minister talk about safe spaces for terrorist finance. So why has her government sat on the report into foreign funding of extremism and radicalisation in the UK? When will this report be released? And what new regulations is the UK bringing forward for UK companies and banks as part of her new global accord on terrorist financing? Mr. Speaker, keeping Britain global is one of our country's most urgent tasks. But the truth is, this country needs a new approach to foreign policy and global cooperation that a Conservative government, in hoc to vested interests, simply cannot deliver. Responding to the grotesque levels of inequality within countries and between them is important to the security and sustainability of our world. In a joint report published in April, the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization recognised what they referred to as the long-lasting displacement as well as large earning losses of workers, and that the negative experience of globalisation has informed the public's rejection of the established political order. The Prime Minister talks of the dumping on steel on global markets, but why did the government fail to take action that the other European nations did at the most acute time when our steel industry is suffering? Mr. Speaker, this government is the architect of the failed austerity policies and now threatens to use Brexit to turn Britain into a low-wage, deregulated tax haven on the shores of Europe. A narrow and hopeless vision of the potential of this country, which would only serve the few. One that would ruin industry, destroy innovation and hit people's living standards. And finally, Mr. Speaker, the US President said a US-UK trade deal will happen quickly. Can the Prime Minister give any detail or timetable or any of the terms of this agreement on environmental protections, workers' rights, consumer rights, product safety, any of those issues that so concern so many people? Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister lost her mandate at home and now she's losing Britain and her influence abroad.
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I say to the right honourable gentleman, on the issue of terrorist financing, it is in fact the United Kingdom that has been not only developing approaches within the UK with working with our financial sector, but is taking this internationally and, as I said, raised this at the G20 and has agreement from those countries sitting around the G20 table that we're going to take this forward together. I think what was important was that we had a separate communiqué on counter-terrorism which specifically identifies issues like working with the financial sector to identify suspicious small flows of funding. This is what the UK has led on. It was the UK's proposal and it was in the communiqué of the G20. He talks about global tax avoidance. It's the UK that has led on the issues of global tax avoidance. Global tax avoidance is only on the agenda of these international meetings because my right honourable predecessor, David Cameron, put it there. It's the UK that has been leading on that. He talks about trade deals. Well, I'm very happy to tell him we're already working with the Americans on what a trade deal might look like. We already have a working group with the Australians. We have a working group with India as well. We are out there. He says that what Britain needs is somebody actually standing up and speaking about these things. What we need is doing these things, and it's exactly what we're doing. And on the issue of climate change, this country has a proud record on climate change. We secured the first truly globally, legally binding agreement on climate change in the Paris Agreement. We're the third best country in the world for tackling climate change. We were at the leading edge in terms of putting our own legislation through in relation to emissions, and this country will continue to lead on this issue. He refers to the question of the sale of arms to Saudi Arabia. I welcome the High Court judgment today. I think this shows, of course, my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, will be making a statement on this later this afternoon, but it shows that we do in this country operate one of the most robust export control regimes in the world. And then finally, he started off by talking about the issue of the government's agenda. This government has an ambitious agenda to change this country. And there are many issues.
Ashworth, you are a cheeky and rather over-excitable whippersnapper. Calm yourself and take some sort of, as I say, soothing medicament. It's a repeated refrain of mine, but with good reason. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, there are many issues on which I would hope that we will be able to achieve consensus across this House. Issues like ensuring that our police and security agencies have the powers they need to be able to deal with the terrorist threat that we face. Issues like responding to the Matthew Taylor report, which I commissioned, to ensure that in the new gig economy, as we see the world of work changing, workers have their rights protected. And finally, I also hope we talked about women's empowerment at this G20 summit. One of the issues I've been concerned about recently is the fact that many female candidates during the general election found themselves bullied and harassed, and in receipt of such bullying and harassment. And I would have thought, as has been referred to by the Right Honourable Lady, the member for Normanton, Pontefract and Castleford, I would have hoped that every leader of a political party in this House would stand up and condemn such action, and it's time that he did so.
John Redwood.
I congratulate the Prime Minister on her many successes at a productive summit, particularly on the trade front, in which she confirmed that ministers are working not just on trade deals with those countries we don't have ones with at the moment but will when we're outside the EU, but also on making sure we transfer the EU ones to the UK as well as the rest of the EU on exit.
Well, I'm happy to give that confirmation to my right honourable friend. There are three areas that we're working on trade. One is obviously looking ahead to those trade agreements we can have with countries that we don't currently have them with as a member of the European Union. The second is ensuring that where there are trade agreements with the EU, as we leave the EU, we're able to roll those forward. And the third area is actually working with countries like India, like Australia, to say what changes can we make now, before we leave the European Union, to improve our trade relationship.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The G20 summit was an eye-opening event to the realities of a UK now floundering around on a global stage, desperately trying to win friends. A disastrous and unpredictable alliance formed with the American president on trade. Goodness knows what a trade deal with America right now would mean for our public services, for food quality and for workers' rights. Indeed, talk about UK-US trade deal was dealt a blow by the Prime Minister's own Justice Secretary, who just hours after the summit ended said it wouldn't be enough on its own. The Prime Minister must now come to her senses. A United Kingdom outside the single market would be ruinous. Our EU friends and partners are moving on without us. Just this year alone, finalising trade deals with Japan and Canada, while the UK readily turns in on itself. Today's Scottish Chamber of Commerce survey shows 61% of Scottish businesses feel that the UK should remain in both the single market and the customs union. It is quite scandalous that the Prime Minister turns a blind eye to the economy in favour of our Eurosceptic colleagues' reckless rhetoric. Mr. Speaker, I welcome the progress made at the G20 summit. I especially pay tribute to the work of the German Chancellor, who hosted and delivered a challenging agenda on global issues. The communiqué is clear that we must redouble our efforts in delivering the Paris Agreement, calling it irreversible. I ask the Prime Minister to set out now the next steps in delivering the Paris Agreement outcomes in the UK. The communiqué also delivers the G20 Africa Partnership to boost growth and jobs across Africa, including an initiative on rural employment, creating 1.1 million new jobs by 2022. Can the Prime Minister explain the UK's role in delivering the initiative and confirm whether the UK role will continue after exiting the EU? Mr Speaker, the agreement to take further action to achieve gender equality is undoubtedly universally welcomed in this House. The conclusions also push the G20 to take immediate and effective measures to eliminate child labour by 2025, forced labour, human trafficking and all forms of modern slavery, a promising step indeed. However, Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister went to Hamburg with an opening core message. She wanted the G20 to tackle terrorism. In particular, she wanted the G20 to tackle terrorist financing. Yep. What staggering hypocrisy. The Prime Minister, who is sitting on a report commissioned by her predecessor, denying us all the truth about terrorist financing in the UK, had the brass neck to call on the G20 to do more. What an absolute outrage. Will she publish the Home Office Extremism Analyst report on terror funding in the UK, and will she set up a public inquiry into questions around the funding of extremism?
Sure that the honourable gentleman wasn't making a personal accusation against the Prime Minister. Order, order. I know what I'm doing in these matters. I hope that he wasn't making a personal accusation of hypocrisy against the Prime Minister. I can't believe that he would knowingly do that, because it is palpably disorderly, and he ought to be aware of that. And if he's not aware of that, it's time he was.
You're watching Live Satellite News.